Right. Good morning, everybody, and thank you to the very able chairperson today. And I think that stretch really worked because I could hear the creaks in my neck. That has probably got to do with the fact that I was just reading through my script yesterday. So good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here and also being here virtually. And we are basically civil liberty engineers. Our training is in law. I'm an academic lawyer, and Darmin is a practicing lawyer, and we share the same passion for tech ethics. So here we go. So thank you. Firstly, I'll be remiss in my duties if I did not thank the organizers. So thank you, Bigit, for inviting us to this event and for us to share our passion and our pursuits. So we enjoy talking about ethics vis-a-vis AI. It is amazing how exponentially the discourse around altruistic and trustworthy AI is thriving, and it is quite ubiquitous to human rights advocacy to actually talk about AI ethics and human rights. Now, it's equally intriguing to see the way people respond to our conversation, taking the lingo that Anne spoke about this morning, having a conversation about ethics. Now, why is it interesting? Because often people say ethics is boring. Why do we have to philosophize? And I've heard these dismissals when I first started teaching IT a long time ago, 15 years ago. And my students would be totally disinterested, only to realize that 15 years later, how important this conversation is. So we didn't realize how interesting the study of IT ethics could be. So Darmin and I started to revisit this discourse sometime last year, and we felt we could use our lived experience as both practicing academic lawyers and just basically thinkers to start this conversation around ethics and AI in Malaysia, and so we formed DESA. So why ethics? If you've mentioned to an IT professional that he or she is bound by legal duty, they'll be very quick to follow this legal bounden duty. But when you speak about ethics, then we are faced with impediments to convince them. So, but Darmin will tell you the discourse is actually quite simple to appreciate.
Good morning, everyone. Just see if this works. I think we'll just use this.
Yeah.
That works. Okay, so the conversation on AI is, in a sense, well represented by what we had in the last speaker, Suen, when she spoke. You look at two parts of it, generally. How it's used, and that's the general conversation of utility. And we're looking at a whole range of things here, aren't we? Every single industry, it's permeating everything from education to insurance, healthcare, we're going to hear about later. And that's the largest part of the conversation. Then you have the secondary part, which seems to be emerging more and more, which is the element of risk. Right? And that seems to be very interestingly a larger part of the conversation at this conference so far. Now, in risk, it will be very hard to actually compartmentalize risk into, the emerging trends of risk. There's so many of them. But broadly, for this particular presentation, I've categorized them into three parts. Largest and most well-known area of privacy, most regulated as well. But privacy is not just on data protection. It encompasses a much larger area. It talks about surveillance. It's known as a gateway right. So it opens up to many other facets, everything from surveillance to free speech and the like. Moving on to the second is the area of bias. Now this has to do a lot more with the actual development of artificial intelligence. And it starts from end to end. What happens when you take a data set that has inbuilt bias, right? So real world bias has been incorporated. And the result that we're seeing actually is that it gets amplified in some situations, right? Through an artificial intelligence system. This is something that we're looking at everything from racial bias, gender bias, disability bias in some cases. And the last component on accountability. Now here really is one of those big problems where whose fault is it if it goes wrong? Now this is where the finger pointing starts. It starts with the person who owns it, the person who developed it, the person who deployed it, the person who cleaned the data. And one of the closely linked issues here is the large issue of explainability. The inability to explain what is going on in maybe a neural net or machine learning systems. And that leads to problems in accountability, especially in decision making based artificial intelligence. So of course this has led to a larger conversation, larger discourse, which just I'll be taking you through.
Thanks, Damien. So essentially, this emergence of this new discourse has a lot to do with what Damien was saying about this sense of using AI and then trying to say that we've taken steps to minimize the risk of the use of AI solutions, in particular the consequences and the follow-through of its, particularly in its utility. So we are often asked, should we not look at law? And this is the answer that I often provide. I always say that not enough, problems have arisen that lawmakers and parliamentarians can sort of regulate. We haven't really utilized AI exponentially, and I think until there's a sense of maturity and there's sort of wider use of AI where there are clear problems, then only we can talk about finding some sort of a concrete legal solution. So what should take its place then? So what we are doing is we are promoting a framework. So I've just looked at the Collins English Dictionary and just sort of wanted to explain away what a framework is. So basically, this is just a part of some guidance that will be part of your value system. And what was interesting is I had embarked on a research and I'm halfway through it, and we were looking at sort of the different types of frameworks that have come around and come about globally. And I came across a study of these frameworks. And what is interesting is the framework is often seen as a precursor to, I suppose, AI law. So until and unless we have a legal solution, which I don't think is going to be very soon, okay? But remember, we were having the same conversation around privacy and data protection 20 years ago, and then suddenly we saw this barrage of legal initiatives. I don't have a magic crystal ball to tell you that that's the way it's going to go. But all I can say is that frameworks do have a very, very sound utility. So many people ask me, why do we need national frameworks? I often say that every country has, as Peter mentioned this morning, about the level or the stage Malaysia is in terms of AI solutions, development, deployment, and utility. Each country has its unique AI ecosystem, and more interestingly, every country has its own national values. So this is the core of my research at the moment. So there are different levels of maturity or lack of, and also different values, political, economic, social, and also religious. But national frameworks require some amount of leadership. It requires some initiative nationally, whether through government or some government agency, to take that first step in drawing out what it thinks are the values that are important in these frameworks. So in the case of a lack of a framework, the responsibility now falls on corporations to create their own and develop their own framework. And this is where much of what we are doing here today, we're going to talk about a number of case studies. So this is just a quote that I took from a piece of research sometime in 2019. And it talked about how important it is to have this kind of ethical value in the way in which we are developing AI solutions. Now, what was surprising was that the researchers in that paper were able to sort of conclude that there are some converging values, and the one in the box in red was seen as global convergence values. Now, I had a bit of a problem, swallowing that, because most of the countries that they looked at, whose frameworks they looked at, were essentially countries that were developed, and clearly there was a big void among the global South nations and economies that they did not have these sort of values because they didn't have frameworks, and Malaysia, I suppose, is one of them. So I'm going to pass now the floor to Dabi. Now, essentially, we're going to look at three different sort of case studies. One is IBM, the second is Google, and then I'll come back and speak to you on Palantir Technologies. Dabi?
Okay, so just before we get into these three different case studies, the reason why we've taken this approach is because we usually end up speaking at a very high level about how you implement or what are the general principles that you want to incorporate into a framework, or why the need for a framework. But many questions have come back to us as to how you actually deploy a framework. And so these three will give you contrasting examples as to what would happen in a situation where you deploy it one way or the other. So we start first with IBM. Now, IBM as an entity, so it's sort of a caveat, as an entity, it's more than a century old. So it's had the opportunity to go through the process of societal change, development, economic change. It's been through the Great Depression. So it has had that mature advancement within its organization. And for that reason, if we look at the way that they're structured in terms of AI ethics specifically. Now, first off, they have an AI ethics board, right, that sits within the organization. Now, their AI ethics board plays an advisory function. Now, this has been questioned, why an advisory function and not having a firm ability to make a decision. But the way that they treat their board is quite different. It's taken on board for every single decision related, as you can see there, to AI, ML, or any kind of technology they're deploying. It's made up of individuals from various parts of the organization. And it has a very strong say in what needs to be done in a particular project. Now, to complement this, they have this position of the AI ethics global leader. Now, this individual, a single person, who currently is Francesca Rossi, she plays a front-facing function to explain to the world what their position is and also engage their staff across the world as to what the position of the company is and how they should be proceeding forward. Now, on the other side of this entity is IBM's Policy Lab. IBM's Policy Lab is very interesting. It's a standalone entity which actually develops policy not just on AI ethics, but almost any interesting area that's coming up, everything from COVID to the latest trends that have been coming. Now, what they essentially are is a research think tank. And they provide these policies both to the employees and again, inwardly and outwardly. Now, you notice this trend in terms of their structure. IBM has taken the position, when you look at all their documentation, they do not speak as IBM does this, IBM shall do this. It doesn't look internally. It speaks as we. Companies should take this position. They've taken a leadership role. And that is where they position themselves in this conversation on AI ethics as leaders. Now, in terms of principles to which they adhere, they come back constantly to this single document. It's a very short document, the Trust and Transparency Principles. Those 3 points there are the actual titles of the principles that they have. Now, if you look at the wording of it, it's crystallized. And if any of you have had the opportunity to draft policy at any point, you know how hard it is actually to crystallize an idea into something. And if you look at the way that they've crafted these 3 principles actually encapsulate many other facets of artificial intelligence, right? And the ethical dilemmas that they face. They've got standalone documents that deal with each one of these principles, and they constantly develop this, but they come back to this as a base. Now, in terms of deployment, how do you actually do this? Look at some of the examples of what IBM has done. The most recent one that's highlighted there, June 2020, where they took a very strong stand in terms of facial recognition technology, where they sort of stepped back and they told both the US government and other governments that they will not be pursuing FRS in terms of surveillance and profiling. Now, this of course comes off what's going on in the US at the moment, and also examples of what's going on in Hong Kong. Now, taking this position is a very strong position to take, but it comes back, as you can see, to their principles, because they've got a very structured principle. They're able to go back to it and say, we will take a firm stand on it. Now, looking at their other advancements, Precision Regulation of AI is a document where they are propounding that there should be precision in the legislation rather than one large overarching piece of legislation that's going to guard the entire AI framework as such. They want precision, and this is what they're putting forward in terms of their policies. Everyday Ethics for AI is a document as well. It's a public document, and they recognize that their own staff, their developers, their tech guys, are finding it difficult to understand where ethics is going. How do I implement it on a daily basis? And so they have Everyday Ethics for AI, which you can freely obtain. Along with this open source AI explainability, trying to address the problem of explainability in AI, they have not solved it, definitely, but this is a toolkit that they put out, and it's open source. And they make it specific that everyone should be trying to build on this, learning from their mistakes. And one of the more interesting ones is when the Pope made a call and said, we might have a problem with AI. We're afraid of it. We're not sure where it's going. Let's have a discussion. And IBM, together with a few other tech giants, Microsoft included, went down, met the Pope, and ended up signing the Rome's call for AI ethics, putting themselves on the map, saying we are going to try and live up to certain standards. Right? So they are cutting across outside the field of tech as well, right, to try and implement, operationalize this. Now we come to Google. Unfortunately, Google is a bit of the polar opposite. Again, just as a caveat, Google is a very young company compared to IBM. And so what they're doing is they're moving fast, moving hard, very consumer facing, and a bit of a knee-jerk reaction, if you ask me. Now, these are Google's principles, right, taken from their principle page. And if you look at the wording, the way that they put some of this in, be accountable to people, right, very broad, uphold high standards of scientific excellence. Now, these leave a lot of room for ambiguity. Operationalizing this is going to be very difficult. Right now, what they also did was they looked at 1.1 to 4 are certain things that they claim they are not going to be involved in. And if you look at it, is technology that's going to cause harm, overall harm. Okay, and they put this specifically out there as a very small category, just 4 points. And let's see where this came from. Google had some serious problems, right, in terms of particularly these two projects, Project Maven and Dragonfly. Maven was dealing with the US Defense Ministry, and what they were trying to do was to build surveillance systems that used drones. Now, once this was made known to the public, massive backlash from both public and internally their employees. I think the petition was 3,000 employees saying that they were not happy with this. Now, what did Google do? Immediately, they had conversations, dropped the project, and stepped away. Now, Dragonfly, similar issues of censorship. They're trying to work with the Chinese government for a search engine, and this would help the Chinese government actually perpetuate surveillance. Now, they dropped this project as well after having backlash, public backlash, and internal employee backlash. Now, if you look at the timelines of these projects, very soon after is when they came up with these principles. So the only deduction that you can come from that is that Google had a knee-jerk reaction and a PR disaster. So they put some principles in place trying to pacify a whole group of people. Now, can you actually implement these principles? That's the big question. And what we've seen in the last couple of weeks is not really. Because they attempted to form a Google AI committee. It was called ATAC, the Advanced Technology External Advisory Council. It lasted a total of 2 weeks, 1 week officially. Right? And some of the reasons that it actually failed, if you look at them, and this is a sort of ongoing conversation right now, there was no clarity as to what this body was going to do. They were meant to meet 4 times a year. Okay, but nobody said what they're meeting about, what they're actually going to be discussing in terms of projects, the actual strength of this organization. The constitution, who was sitting on it? There were 8 members meant to sit on it, and that was one of the biggest problems. One of the individuals was not very appealing to general members of the public because of sentiments. Google did not engage with their own community, their employees, their staff, as well as the general community before it set up this particular ethics board. And underlying all of this was that big elephant in the room, the fact that the principles that they're meant to uphold were completely ambiguous. And technically Google could wiggle its way out of any one of these projects by using a very broad understanding of what each principle should be. And this role of this particular committee would be really nothing. Okay? And these were some of the problems as why this committee has failed. Now, interestingly, the next company that we're going to be looking at is the company that took over Project Maven from Google.
So I'm back. Thanks, Darmin. The slight error in the slides, it should be the third case study. Sometimes lawyers are terrible at counting. So there you go. So taking from what Darmin just said, that Palantir Technologies essentially picked up Project Maven, and I like to introduce Palantir Technology as the ethics rogue. But the jury is out. You can decide at the end of the day whether they are an ethics rogue company or not. So essentially, let me give you a bit of background to Palantir Technologies. It started in 2003 with its two founders, Peter Thiel and Alex Karp. It's very interesting how Palantir Technologies is politically aligned with the Republican Party and the Trump administration. And a lot of their work essentially is data gathering and data analysis, and you can pick this up from their website, and producing data mining software. Now, it's interesting the time in which Palantir appeared on our landscape, that was at the wake of the 9/11 attacks on the Twin Towers in New York. And what essentially the role they played was they filled in the gaps in the intelligence gathering systems at that time, because there was a clear exposure of these sort of deficits. And so one of their first and earliest customers were the CIA, naturally, and other US government intelligence agencies and the US military, so much so that Bloomberg Business gave them this title that they are an indispensable tool for gathering US intelligence and the war against terror. But controversies started to appear from the formation of this company. And one of the two main controversies are the quotes that are put up on this slide sort of articulate one of the first of the two controversies. So Jeremy Scott is the lawyer for Epic, and what they did is they brought an action against ICE, which is the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency in the US, as to how they were using data analysis and their mining software to deal with immigration issues, which is very much a strong mandate of the Trump administration. So the first controversy that Palantir got its feet totally mired in was the problem of they providing technical support for controversies surrounding US immigration policies. The second had to do with sort of an insufficient safeguard of the kind of software and the kind of work that they were doing for law enforcement agencies, local law enforcement agencies in terms of surveillance. So they were forced, because of a lot of backlash, and Anonymous perhaps had something to do with the fact that, and I use the word quite explicitly, that they were forced to have an internal governance system, because Anonymous discovered that Palantir contributed to a proposal that they had put together to sabotage WikiLeaks at the time of the wiki dump, the big wiki dump from 2010 and thereon, therefore, and forthwith. And so basically this proposal contained sort of technology initiatives that you could take to fight WikiLeaks, including cyber attacks, as well as pressuring their journalists. And Palantir was exposed and therefore had to issue a public apology. So this is the kind of pressure that big tech companies are actually facing. Now, Palantir is actually quite a little boy compared to the giants such as IBM, Microsoft, and Google, because they're quite young. They've not been public listed yet, and I'll talk about that shortly. So they very quickly created this advisory council. There you are, okay, with Darwin talked about knee-jerk measures. Okay, so to appease this sort of, opposition to what Palantir was doing, they created a council. And then this is the first time that the CEO and the founder of Palantir comes up and says and gives this sort of commitment to protecting privacy and some kind of civil liberty. So, but the narrative from Mr. Karp is quite interesting, because I like to do thematic analysis. So I did an analysis of his statements that we find in the public domain, and this narrative can sometimes be quite polar extremes. Okay, so we'll talk about that shortly. So that they, since they were told that they were not meeting up the standards of, rights of privacy, data protection, and breaching human rights obligations, okay, so they came up with these core principles. So the mission was, of course, to protect privacy and civil liberties. But there's always this contrasting narrative from Alex Karp. And this is where he went into sort of, he was quite irate how he said Silicon Valley was making this sort of moralistic and ethical judgments for the industry. So he says that one of the things that he says is that Palantir are not going to be complying, I suppose, or will not be aligning itself with the other Silicon Valley executives, because he felt that they were imposing their own moral framework on the United States of America. So he said that should be left to parliamentarians and that should be left to the courts. Essentially, that's what he said. But I suppose there's a small footnote here. What Alex Karp doesn't realize, that he's a lawyer, he's got a law degree and a PhD in social theory. What he doesn't realize is the folly of his statement. Where there is legal and policy vacuum, then you have to rely on some kind of internal ethical moral standards of your corporation or your organization. So this is the problem with Palantir. They do have their policy, and their policy essentially gives these 4 key assurances, and you can look this policy up, okay? And since it's in the public domain, I'm not going to expand on it in detail, but to cut a long story short, essentially it focuses on data. So it just talks about its own processes, how it collects data from its customers, and remember, most of its clients and customers are government agencies, all right? So essentially, they don't really work for the private sector, they work for the government sector. So it focuses on data. So what does it ignore? Okay, so we have to ask some questions. What about determining human rights risks and impacts of how the technology and the AI solutions that they have provided has a human rights impact? So when they decide to do business with government agencies and corporations, how are their AI solutions being used? Are there ethical, unethical, or harmful consequences of the use of the product and the service that they are providing? So these are some of the questions that have been raised. Are there any steps that Palantir takes to mitigate the harm that arises from these products and services of their creation? So this is where I introduce you to a very strong lobby body in the United States called the Investor Alliance for Human Rights. They came up with a damaging report. Now, let me just give you a little bit of background about the Investor Alliance. They're an alliance of investors, okay, not rocket science there. They hold something like US $4 trillion worth of assets that they manage, and in 18 countries. So they are a really powerful lobby group. And they came up with a very damaging report. They reported that the report claims that Palantir has enabled human rights harms. So here you have a small company that is about to be public listed, okay? And this is the report that's coming through the media, and it is getting a lot of negative publicity. So these are some of the more recent controversies, okay? So they're into predictive policing. So they had to drop this thing called Operation Laser. What Palantir has done is that they've developed 2 kind of platforms. One is called the Gotham software, that is for governments, and another one is called the Foundry software, which is for the private sector. So essentially what they do is they deploy this software to do predictive policing. So they do statistical analysis on, forecasting criminal liability. But what happened is the use of this product or this software has resulted in basically minority communities being victimized. This is, of course, a lot to do with what Darwin was saying. It's probably as a result of biased data. And of course, the most controversial is their work with ICE. Okay, ICE has been successfully sued by Epic. Okay, you can read this up, it's in the public domain. And why? Because they were complicit. So they created this software for the government agencies, and essentially by creating it, the argument is that Palantir is complicit because they facilitated it. And of course, more ominous is the amount of public health data, and I'm sure Dr. Harvey will be very interested to know this, okay, because Palantir has partnered up with the US Department of Health and Human Services. And what they're going to do is they're collecting data for the US government from all these hospitals that are dealing with the COVID. And of course, who has jumped on the bandwagon? The UK National Health Service. Of course, NHS doesn't seem to have much standards when it comes to sharing data. They have shared data with, I think, Microsoft and also Amazon, I believe. I'm not very sure. I stand corrected. But essentially now, the most important data during this global health crisis is secondary health data of people, and Palantir is managing this data, studying it, analyzing it. All right. So, and also to mention employee dissidency. Palantir has faced a lot of internal dissidency. So this is a company that's small, but it is very ominous. Okay. So one of the things, okay, I've jumped the gun here. Okay, is the cost of the absence. Now, this is very important. You can see a golden thread running through our presentation here, that there is a cost if there is an omission or absence of an ethical or a human rights-based approach impact assessment standard. And especially with Palantir, there's a lot of opacity in the way they do things. All right. So, for example, in 2015, they valued themselves at US 20 billion or so. But just recently, there was a report that said, how did they arrive at that sum? Because the investors, an investor group has assessed that their value is actually just in excess of 10 US billion. So this is the kind of opacity and lack of transparency that we're dealing with in this organization. And of course, Dami and I, we are often asked this question, as do a lot of data and tech ethicists around the world. What is the value of advisory boards? Now, we allude to the fact that there is a value, but is it simply a tick box approach? Are we being disingenuous by saying that, hey, this is the window dressing, this is the advisory board, but are we really taking the advice meted out by these advisory boards? How do we deal? They don't make decisions, so essentially it becomes a tick box exercise. So in that sense, we have sort of given a juxtapositioning of how you see an old company, you see big giants, and then you see this emerging company that has so much of power in its hands that government agencies and governments, especially the United States, requires its service, requires its partnership, its know-how. And this sort of talks about what I mentioned in terms of this sort of new form of colonization and imperialism that is appearing with big tech companies. Now, because of shortage of time, I will have to quickly summarize some of the emerging strengths in our work. First and foremost, we feel that a lot of ethical frameworks, whether at the national level or organizational level, must take into account values that are cultural and national. Because we say, on a scale, every nation is developing in this AI ecosystem at a different pace. Secondly, people are divided. Researchers, academics, specialists in this area are divided. Should we go for an ethics-based approach, or should it be a human rights-based approach? Well, I believe that must be a merger of both. And this is the third thing. There's a lack of operationalizing ethics. How do we operationalize it? Many people get, like I say from the outset, are frightened when we use the word ethics. And the question is, we need to implement it. And I say, in particular, particularly in the global south. Well, there is, of course, some positive that comes out of our research. For example, Peter, this is what I was telling you about during the tea break, the OECD AI Policy Observatory. So they've given a latest global map. So you do see a lot of countries that are developing or underdeveloped economically coming on board. For example, Thailand is there with 3 documents. So there is some euphoria as well. And the euphoria also stems from the fact that we are seeing new iterations of AI ethics framework. And I think this is where the Singapore government has done really well. They had their first national framework last year in January. They have a second iteration this year. So they're really leaps and bounds ahead of most people. But of course, we have our challenges, okay, measuring values, determining a metrics, linking these values to the shortcomings in the framework, and also in the shortcomings as to how we are developing AI solutions. And the presentation before spoke about, what are some of the value systems that you need to include when you're developing AI solutions. I will now pass the floor to Dami.
Ladies and gentlemen, just to cap off this last slide on this, we often look at these AI frameworks, ethical standards as very difficult areas to delve into. They're costly, right? But one thing I just want to highlight is that who's leading the charge at the moment? I spoke very highly of IBM just now, right? And IBM is one of those companies that's leading it. But let's also remember that IBM was the one that coined the term smart city with this endeavor. IBM now steps away from facial recognition, which it helped create over the years. Right now, who is leading the charge in this? It's at the end of the day, it's corporations, and corporations are motivated by profit. And this is the danger that we have. Governments are slow to react at the moment to this area. And what we want to highlight at the last part is that maybe it needs to be a firm collective effort by everyone, because the consequence has been pointed out numerous times is real to businesses, to societies, to individuals, to everyone. The consequence is there, and we're beginning to see this again and again. Right, so with that, I'll leave it to Q&A if we have any questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Darmin. Okay, guys, let's give them a round of applause. Alright, so we have any questions from the floor? Anyone? Alright, thanks.
Hi, thanks for the great presentation, very informative. So my question is, because in the States, like obviously AI is very developed there, right? The practice of AI. But in the case of Malaysia, like what companies do you think should start considering if they have not done so far in creating an ethics committee internally to make sure that whatever that they are doing or using customers' data is compliant?
Thanks for the question. I think very often what happens is people look at these, for example, even the examples we gave, they are very big, large companies, $30 billion valuation and above. I don't think that should be the thought process. Even in the US, we're not talking about huge entities that can have an impact. With AI, the unique thing is a company as small as one that's set up in a cafe can have a national impact. Clearview AI is a good example of that in the US. They're the ones that are leading FRS technology, and we know nothing about them, really. I think that ethical boards, the term board can be very misleading. It doesn't have to be a composition of so many people. But I think it should start at the smallest level. I think it should begin even at the stage of education.
Yeah.
Right? In business schools, in technology schools, data scientists should be learning about these concepts from the get-go. And then it should be implemented at every level of company. Now there's a cost to it, no doubt. Right? And people see that risk. It's the same question that the company asks. Do I need someone with giving me legal advice as I start my company and move forward? And they usually think, no, I don't, until they hit that contractual breach and they realize the consequence that it's had. And I see this happening with artificial intelligence as well. If you don't implement it at an early stage, when the consequence hits, it's too severe for the company to deal with at a later stage. So to answer the question, I think it should be every level, but on a sliding scale. I'm not saying revamp your entire company, but take baby steps. Learning about, because there are free toolkits that are available, there are many checklists that are available as well online.
And I think, Anne, taking from your lead this morning in terms of education and awareness, and I think one of the challenges is when I started my presentation, I spoke about how I dabbled into teaching IT law and ethics 15, 17 years ago, and this is how far behind we are. But I would say, for example, this is not a marketing peg for Health University, but this is exactly what we did. We looked at the IT syllabus and we said, how could we integrate ethics? So at the undergraduate level, at the master's level, we have to create that awareness. And as you've mentioned, clearly, you are still cognitively able to the age of 24 to have some sort of, mental malleability or cognitive malleability that we can still inculcate values and that moral compass that you spoke about. And that's where, when individuals think about morality and when they start interacting with their community, that's when it becomes ethics. And so there is a space for this sort of creation of awareness. And this is why I feel that there should be leadership. There should be some kind of political will and leadership to say that, as highlighted by Peter, we are at this stage of development of AI in this great, glorious and good nation of ours, but we need to start taking baby steps. All right, and this is, okay, that's very nationalistic of me, I'm very patriotic, but there you are. Okay? And I think this is brilliant because what Darmain and I are doing, and what you are doing, what Peter is doing, what Bigit is doing, is essentially exploring this vacuum. All right, and this is where we have so much of guidance globally, and so we should start taking baby steps. So, why not? And I think, and a good example was, and we were talking about this last night, is how small companies create policies, remarkable policies to deal with the sort of mitigation of risk and being a good corporate citizen. For example, in Malaysia now we have the Section 17 capital A of the MACC Act, which says that if a company is complicit in the kind of corrupt practices that its employees are undertaking, then the directors would be personally liable. But then, before the law was in place, you had small little companies already implementing these sort of values in their organizations. So I think on a scale, it doesn't quite matter. And I said, your ethics board doesn't have to be all singing and dancing, and this is it. This is where I think the euphoria comes, that take steps and then see how it goes and go back. So you work with hindsight and then foresight and see how your corporation or organization can progress.
Yeah, just to add on, I just have one comment because I have been working as a working professional for so many years, and then I decided to go back and pursue my master's. And what I thought was that really stood out in my journey is what I talked about, permissive intervention. They have very strict ethics boards.
Yes.
That if you do not get approved by them, you basically cannot run any kind of experiments.
Yeah.
And maybe to the psychology society, it seems very common. It's like a no-brainer. If you want to run
Culture.
any kind of experiment, you have to get approval. So actually that sparked my thinking that why we are not teaching in higher education in the subjects of IT, in the subjects of data, in the subjects of computer science. Why don't they have an ethics board? Because clearly we are going into a space where we are converging, right? Technology is converging
Absolutely.
with human rights. So I just wanted to comment, I think higher education providers probably really need to consider having ethics as a subject, especially if they're in tech. Because before we were thinking you're in IT, right? Other than don't go through people's heartbeats, you don't need to be you don't need to be so strict about it. But right now I feel like that is an extremely important subject to be taught.
Absolutely. I mean, due diligences existed in so many different disciplines, isn't it? I teach a variation of ICT law subjects. Darwin teaches legal tech at our university. And essentially, this sort of multidisciplinary approach needs to be taken. And since in terms of IT profession developing, evolving, and there must be that threshold, there must be that standard. But of course, with ethics board, it's just how we empower them, right? Okay, we can just call them advisory boards, or we can empower them to make decisions, as Dami mentioned. Yeah, definitely, this sort of social engineering has to begin, and I think we need to start and take that discourse and conversation further. Yes, brilliant comment. Thank you, Annie.
Okay, I've got a question. You mentioned that there are different cultural aspects, right? Will actually drive the ethics of different countries, right? Could you give some examples on how different cultures can actually drive the development of different ethical frameworks in the various countries?
Yes. I'd like to give you the example of Japan, actually, which is two examples I gave at a conference a few weeks ago in the UK. One was Japan and the other was Singapore. So when we look at these two cultures, one thing that they do have in common is that front of their national policy is the push for inventive economy. And this is very interesting. But for the Singaporeans, it is more of an issue of economic flourishing, economic development, that if we have lesser constraints and restrictions, that the environment will be more creative, it will develop more freely. I can get that. But at the very same time, what they did is they came up with a framework that says, we are not going to dictate to you what you should be doing in terms of ethics, but we do advise you that you need to, it's good for you to come up with an internal governance structure and an assessment process for due diligence. Now, Japan is very interesting because here it's not so much of creating an inventive economy, but it's also very cultural. The Japanese people are not individualistic in nature. A lot of them think about national collectivism. So that sort of nationalistic values are so different in, say, in the West, which is very individualistic, or in the UK as a result of Thatcherism or something like that. I'm not going to go into that, but just to give you, an idea. I will not, make an individualistic, rights-based civil liberties claim as an individual, because it may not be for the greater good of the nation state. So this is very interesting. And so when we talk about Japan, the time Prime Minister Abe had already introduced a very strong initiative to promote AI invention, that Japan should be the AI solution provider, a leading provider. And only much later, so there is a time scale, only much later, and Peter, you can actually see this on the OECD AI Policy Observatory. Okay, it's a fantastic source. And then you will see the time scale. Only much later did you then see that they are now thinking about ethics. So eventually they got there. All right, so create a flourishing environment for invention, and then ethics takes the second initiative, is to introduce some kind of ethical and moral standards.
Okay, great. We have some questions from our online audiences. Let's just go a few more. From Ilham Badruddin, he asked, where do we start in creating an AI ethics framework in Malaysia? Is there a committee or board already looking into this? And with whom we can contribute the ideas to?
So I think Ilham, is it?
Yes, Ilham.
Ilham can give me a call and I have a cup of coffee. And that's where we're going to start. Because that's where I think we are at the moment. Conversations have been had in pockets. And what we need to get is to the tipping point. We need to have critical mass before something is going to shift. And where that critical mass is going to come from is, yes, it should be a top-down approach. Government should be advising us, possibly. But there has been stagnant movement. It's moved, it's stopped, and it's been pending. And I think someone's got to give it that push. And that has to be us. It has to be corporates. It has to be people that are engaging in the field. It has to be people who are passionate about this subject. So yes, that's where I think it starts.
Can I just give him some advice? Okay, Ilham, please get into the World Wide Web and just look up the AI, Singaporean AI National Policy Framework, and they have a lot of guidance there on how to implement governance. Okay, have a look, believe you me, it's fantastic. And don't forget the OECD AI Policy Observatory website.
Great. So we have someone anonymously asking us, do you think the creation of an ethics framework should include everyone and not just the tech people? Why?
Yes, most definitely. This question has been asked quite a few times actually, and actually the question has been phrased in a different way. That why has it only involved tech individuals? And it's definite that it's very apparent now that this can't just involve tech individuals, because the impact is on everyone. Stakeholders are consumers. It's you and I. It's everyone that's involved on a day-to-day basis. So it has to involve every facet of society: citizens, corporates, and government together.
Would you like to give the example of the smart city? You said that you need to look at urban developers and the community effects.
Yeah. So, yes, as an example.
Yeah.
So smart cities, when implementation came about, in multiple smart cities, one of the things that they looked at was who's actually implementing these projects. So it was private companies engaging with government, and the conversation sort of went on there. But the impact that it was having was on the average citizen. And this is where the conversation stopped. And if we look at, for example, Toronto as a smart city, it started large, big dreams, scaled down very quickly, and all that came from public backlash. Because these conversations were not had together. And right now that project's been abandoned completely, the entire smart city project. So
Great. We have one from Kalai Selvi Redinam asking us, when you mentioned about the principles that some companies like Google have stated, is that based on some derived standards already there, or if they're formulated?
So thanks for that question, Kalasavi, and thanks for being so interactive in this session this morning. And thank you for that question, because one of the things that I wanted to mention and I omitted to mention was the fact that there are a lot of international frameworks that exist. So one of the leading one is by IEEE. You can always refer to OECD. You can also look at the European Commission document on this. So in a sense, there are these principles. Is that Asilama principles? And these are international organizations or regional organizations that have come up with these iterations. Okay, so they've been amended, they've been edited, and I think this is the thing. It's interesting to see, like for example, the first edition and the second edition of these principles, because you can see that there's a movement, there's a change, there's a fluidity, and it's quite organic. So these are some of the international organizations that you can refer to for these principles, but you also have some very good national frameworks. And to get those national frameworks, again, I'm doing a lot of piping up for OECD here today. Go to the OECD AI Policy Observatory, and you'll be able to get. And of course, that paper that I mentioned.
Great. So we have someone asking us also, how can we accelerate lawmaking or policy creation to protect citizens from manipulation through AI-based technologies that are created in other countries?
I will pass the mic to Dharmeet for difficult questions.
So accelerating legislation, the fastest way to do it is have something very big go wrong. And then there's a sudden push by a nation state to get it fixed. And I don't think we want to wait for that. What we want to do is actually, and this is what that's what I spoke about the earlier part of the slides, where we get frameworks moving first. Right? So we have frameworks can operate, of course, at a national level, but we can't get that moving. We have to come together and possibly by industry, right? We could have banking industry, payments industries, insurance industries coming together to formulate their own mini set of principles, and then putting it down in practice, getting it wrong, and then fixing it as it moves along. And that's where it was the critical mass that I was talking about. So how do we get it to move is with voice, right? How do we get anything to move within a country? We have to be speaking about it more frequently. We have got to stop being shy about this. Now, interestingly, one of IBM's research papers that was released showed that where's the deficit within a corporation in terms of this ethics board model that you want to come up with. At board level, there is a tendency to talk about it. They agree that it's important. At an employee level, they tend to agree it's very important for implementation. So where's the deficit? It's at C level. People at the C level seem to think that this is too much of a burden to operationalize. And that's what we need to fix. So if we identify that these are the problems, getting it moving, let's start speaking to C level.
Can I just add? So if I can just add, in terms of creating awareness and education, Dharmeet and I feel that because we're both lawyers, we felt that there was a need to create this awareness even amongst lawyers. And it's amazing when we say that we are tech ethicists and they all just look at us thinking we are mad. Can that two oxymoron words go together, technology and ethics, And so what we've done is we've started to convene a series of articles in the oldest journal in Malaysia, the Malayan Law Journal, which is published by LexisNexis. And our first article is coming out in October. So if anyone is interested in getting their hands on the introductory article, please do get in touch with us through LinkedIn. And if the questions are still coming, also get in touch with us on LinkedIn and we will be able to answer those questions. If let's say tomorrow, because we got you thinking, and the question comes tomorrow, so get in touch with us. Thank you.
Okay, we can have about 3 more, sorry.
Yeah, sure.
Great. We have Teo Wulong asking us, what are the key success to embrace data and digital from top management?
Sorry, the key success.
Key success to embrace data and digital from top management.
Okay, so we can comment in terms of if the leadership within a corporation embraces these sort of things that we've been talking about, ethical standards and ethical frameworks. I think the idea is, if you market yourself as an ethical AI solution provider, or if you're a insurance company or a bank that is using AI, as a solution to some of your processing or your analysis or making decisions. I think you can use ethics really as a marketing tool. I think if you have customers and consumers who are aware that these are the standards within your organization, surely it's a win-win situation.
That's nice. That's great. Okay, we have Diva asking us. She just made a great statement. A very nice presentation by both the speakers and good examples given. We have Rian Ashwin Putucherry asking us, what is the state of AI ethics frameworks in China and China's contribution to internal AI ethics frameworks? What do you think?
To our knowledge, none.
Okay.
To our knowledge. But then again, as I said, to the wonderful question there, to the person posing that question to us, I think what is interesting is, again, let's not be very judgmental about, even Malaysia doesn't have a national ethical framework, and the government, I hope, is promoting, AI as the private sector is, But I also feel that it's very quick to judge that someone does not have a framework, because let's spin this a little differently. What if you are being a little bit more cautious? Maybe too cautious, but like I said, every country's ecosystem is different. And talking about China, you have to understand values, cultural values do have an impact. So if you talk about whether it is illegal for an employer or a company to give bribes, let's say in China, yeah, it's fine. Because culturally, it may not be an issue, an ethical issue. But that's again, this is our research, that national values do determine whether ethical frameworks should be adopted, and first place, whether they should be thought about and written out. Yeah.
So I just want to very often we take this approach that great human rights starts with the West and then gets absorbed to the rest of the world. And I think with AI frameworks, it's one of the situations where it's so new and so crisp that we don't need to take that approach. It is very culturally sensitive. And I think that we should start expecting that countries are going to react differently and that it should react differently. We have got an amazing cultural base here in Asia. Malaysia should not need to look left and right, even to Thailand or Singapore, and start developing internally. Our base is there strong enough. And even in terms of China, a lot of people spoke very questionably about China's privacy model for the longest time. And if you look now at its current privacy rules that's implementing, they're quite high. Right? And it is just a question of how they're implementing it. And that's not to say that any other government is not breaching their own rules. The US has been the center of so many debates in terms of privacy. The CIA itself, directly. So we need to move away, I feel, from that model of looking at rights coming from one part of the world and the rest of us looking up to it.
Fantastic. We have one last one from Diva. She want to ask your opinion. Which city in Malaysia would be best to start as a smart city project?
Oh, we've got quite a few already. I think we've got quite a large number. I wouldn't say best to start. I'd say try not to start in the most populated cities. Selangor, PJs, they're very populated, they're dense, it's hard to implement. A mid-sized city, a test city would be better. But rather than look at which city should start, you're looking from many different angles: cost, usability of technology, your IoT, your infrastructure. But from our angle, from the ethics side, from the privacy side, I'd say start with the test bed. What I mentioned in Toronto was how things can go completely wrong. But there are many other cities that are implementing it without giving a second glance to these issues. Yeah. Our current national privacy framework mentions the word privacy, I think, 3 times in total. Words, right? Not sections. So it's something that maybe we want to look at as how we are going to implement these technologies. And they're already being rolled out many places in our country.
Great. Thank you so much, Jarmaine and Dr. Jasper.
Just want to add, it cannot be tech for tech's sake in smart cities. It should be, you have to look at the purpose that it wants to achieve. So, you've got to think about, if you want to put up facial recognition, software surveillance, essentially you have to ask yourself, is this a city that has a crime problem? So it has to fit, you have to rationalize, you have to justify it. You cannot just because someone is trying to invest. I mean, this is what Alphabet was trying to do in Toronto. Just trying to be city planners. And tech companies are not city planners. They're not city dwellers either. So this is a little dangerous when you want to just simply involve tech companies and look at tech solutions because it's the sexy thing to do. Okay, it must be rationalized, it must be justified, and taxpayers are paying for this. So then it's another question altogether. Thank you.